I still remember the way the conference room went silent the moment my name was called. Victor Hale didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The disappointment in his tone cut deeper than shouting ever could. "Margaret? Explain these numbers?" Every head turned toward me at once. Young faces. Impatient faces. Some curious. Some already convinced I didn't belong there. I could feel their judgment before a single word left my mouth. My hands rested on the printed report in front of me. The same report I had checked 3 times the night before. The same one I stayed late to finish while the rest of the office emptied out around me. I remembered the glow of the computer screen, the cold cup of coffee beside my keyboard, the quiet promise I made to myself that I would not fail, not after everything it took just to get through those doors. But the numbers on that page weren't mine. Columns had shifted. Totals had changed. Entire figures I had never entered were now staring back at me like evidence of a crime I didn't commit. Victor stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, eyes cold and unreadable. "Did you even verify the final calculations?" he asked. My throat tightened. I wanted to answer. I wanted to defend myself. But something inside me froze, not because I didn't know the answer, but because one terrifying thought had begun to take shape in the back of my mind. Someone in that room wanted me to fail, and they had started on my very first week. I hadn't expected to be sitting in a conference room surrounded by strangers again at 59 years old. For most of my life, my world had been measured in quiet responsibilities, doctor visits, prescription schedules, late-night worries that never made it into polite conversation. Years earlier, I had left the workforce to care for my husband, Daniel, when his health began to decline. What started as occasional doctor visits turned into hospital stays, insurance battles, and sleepless nights beside machines that beeped in steady rhythm. After Daniel passed, my mother's health began to fail, and once again, life asked me to step away from everything else. By the time both of them were gone, the world had moved forward without me. Technology changed. Workplaces changed. Even the way people talked about experience had changed. Experience used to mean wisdom. Now, it sometimes meant outdated. But sitting alone in my quiet house after my mother's funeral, I realized something I wasn't ready to admit before. I didn't just need income. I needed purpose. I needed to prove, to myself more than anyone else, that my time hadn't passed me by. That's how I found myself applying for positions I once would have considered beneath my qualifications. And when the offer came through from a freight logistics company in Des Moines, an intern position, of all things, I accepted without hesitation. My daughter had tried to be supportive, but I could hear the worry beneath her encouragement. "Mom," she said one evening over the phone, "offices aren't always kind to older workers anymore. Just be careful." I told her I'd be fine. But deep down, I carried her warning with me like a quiet shadow. On my first morning at the company, I arrived nearly 40 minutes early. Old habits die hard, especially the kind that once kept families running through chaos. The building stood tall and glass-fronted, reflecting the pale morning sky like it had nothing to hide. Inside, everything moved fast. Phones rang, keyboards clicked in rapid bursts, conversations overlapped in low, confident voices. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going and what they were doing. I moved more slowly, carefully observing every detail, determined not to make even the smallest mistake. Most of the employees were young, mid-20s, maybe early 30s. They dressed casually, but carried themselves with an ease that came from familiarity. A few glanced at me as I walked past, their expressions neutral but curious. I overheard 2 voices near the coffee station. "Did they really hire an intern that old?" One whispered, "I guess so." The other replied, "Must be desperate for work." I pretended not to hear, but the words settled somewhere deep in my chest. That morning, I was introduced to Victor Hale, the department manager. He was tall, precise in his movements, and carried an expression that rarely softened. When he shook my hand, his grip was firm but brief, like he had already decided how much attention I deserved. "We maintain high standards here," he said without smiling. We don't have time for long learning curves. I nodded, forcing confidence into my voice. I understand, I replied. But inside, I felt the quiet pressure of expectation settling heavily on my shoulders. Not long after, I was assigned my first task. I had expected something simple, organizing files, reviewing data entries, perhaps shadowing another employee until I learned the system. That's what interns usually did. After all, instead, I received a stack of financial reconciliation reports thick enough to make my stomach tighten. These need to be reviewed and finalized by tomorrow morning, Victor said, sliding the folder across the desk. Tomorrow morning. I stared at the documents, feeling the weight of responsibility settle in my hands. This wasn't beginner work. This was the kind of task usually handled by experienced staff. Before I could question it, another voice spoke beside me. You'll be okay, a woman said gently. I turned and saw Elena Brooks standing there. She wore a warm smile that immediately softened the tension I felt. Her tone carried reassurance, like someone used to helping others find their footing. I'll show you how the system works, she added. Victor expects results, but once you understand the workflow, it gets easier. Gratitude flooded through me. Thank you, I said sincerely. For the rest of the afternoon, Elena guided me through the software, file locations, submission processes, version controls. She spoke patiently, never rushing, never showing frustration. By early evening, most employees had packed up and left. The office grew quieter, the constant noise fading into occasional echoes of footsteps and distant voices. I stayed behind. Coffee sat beside my keyboard, long forgotten as it turned cold. My shoulders ached from leaning forward, double-checking columns of numbers again and again. Every total was verified, every entry cross-referenced. I refused to allow doubt to find its way into my work. At one point, just before saving the final version, the system hesitated. A brief freeze. The cursor blinked once, twice, then resumed. I frowned slightly but continued. After finishing, I saved the file and emailed the final report to Victor and Elena, making sure to timestamp everything carefully. Then I gathered my things, switched off my desk light, and walked out into the dim evening parking lot. I told myself I had done everything right. I told myself the worst was behind me. But sitting in that conference room the next morning, staring at numbers that weren't mine, I realized something I hadn't been willing to consider before. Mistakes happen. But this didn't feel like a mistake. Because when the meeting finally ended and I returned to my desk, hands still trembling, I opened my saved file again, my original copy. And the numbers there were correct. That was when I noticed the timestamp. The file had been edited, not by accident, not by system error, edited after I sent it. And at that moment, something deep inside me went cold, because one simple truth settled into place with terrifying clarity. Someone inside that office had changed my work, and whoever did it had just declared war on my future. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those numbers again, the wrong totals, the shifted columns, Victor's cold stare across the conference table. My mind replayed the moment over and over, searching for something I might have missed. A careless click, a forgotten entry, a simple human error. But every memory led to the same conclusion. I had done everything right. When I walked into the office the next morning, I arrived earlier than usual, hoping to avoid curious stares. The hallway lights were still dim, and the building carried that quiet morning stillness that exists before the workday officially begins. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. But that fragile calm shattered the second I heard voices near the coffee station. "That's her," one whispered. I froze mid-step. "The intern who messed up the quarterly numbers," another voice added quietly. I kept walking as if I hadn't heard. But the words clung to me like smoke. I poured myself coffee with steady hands, though inside my chest, something tightened painfully. Reputations, I realized, could fall apart overnight. And once broken, they were nearly impossible to rebuild. I had just reached my desk when Elena appeared beside me. "Morning," Maggie, she said warmly, as if nothing unusual had happened the day before. Her voice carried the same calm reassurance it always had, the same gentle tone that had comforted me when I first arrived. Morning, I replied, forcing a small smile. She leaned against the side of my desk. Don't let yesterday get to you, she said softly. Victor can be harsh, especially when deadlines are tight. I nodded, grateful for her kindness. It felt good to hear someone speak to me like I wasn't already written off. I just don't understand what went wrong, I admitted. Elena tilted her head slightly. Did you double-check the version history before submitting? She asked casually. The question caught me off guard. Version history. I had checked my numbers. Verified calculations. Reviewed totals. But version history? No, I admitted. I didn't think I needed to. She gave a reassuring smile. It happens, she said. These systems can be tricky at first. For a brief moment, I felt relief again. Maybe this really was a technical mistake. Something unfamiliar with the software. Something I could fix. Later that morning, Elena sat beside me and walked through several parts of the system again. She explained how files were saved, how backups were created, how version changes could be tracked. Her tone remained patient, steady, almost comforting. But halfway through the session, something strange caught my attention. A folder flashed briefly on her screen. Archive, restricted access. Before I could read more, Elena clicked quickly and closed the window. That's not something interns need to worry about, she said smoothly. Her tone remained friendly, but something about the speed of her movement unsettled me. I nodded anyway. Still, the image stayed in my mind. Later, while she explained another section of the workflow, I noticed something else. She logged into one part of the system using her credentials. Then, moments later, she accessed another section under a different permission level. I didn't question it. Not yet. But I remembered it. Before long, Victor assigned me another task. It came much sooner than I expected. A large data set appeared in my inbox, accompanied by a short message. Review and finalize before end of day. No instructions. No explanation. Just pressure. I stared at the file for a long moment before opening it. The dataset was larger than anything I had handled so far. Rows of numbers stretched across the screen, some labeled with unfamiliar codes I didn't recognize. I glanced toward Elena. You'll be fine, she said reassuringly. Just follow the same steps. Her confidence steadied me, at least for a while. I worked carefully, double-checking every line, every calculation. I kept handwritten notes beside me, a habit from years ago, back when digital systems weren't trusted without paper backups. Hours passed. By mid-afternoon, I reopened the file to review my progress. That was when I noticed it. Several rows were missing. Not hidden. Not collapsed. Gone. My stomach tightened instantly. I scrolled up and down the page, scanning every section again. Nothing. Entire entries had vanished. Maybe I deleted them by accident. I thought, maybe I hit the wrong key. With growing urgency, I opened the version history tool Elena had mentioned earlier. The system displayed a timeline of changes. My original save time appeared first. Then another timestamp appeared beneath it, modified after submission. My pulse began to pound. I leaned closer to the screen, reading carefully. The modification hadn't been made under my account. It had been made under Elena's. I stared at the name, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe she fixed something, I told myself. Maybe she corrected an error I didn't notice. That had to be it. It had to be. Just as I leaned back in my chair, trying to calm my breathing, I felt movement behind me. Everything working okay? I turned sharply. Elena stood directly behind me, smiling gently. Too gently. Yes, I said quickly. Just reviewing some numbers. She leaned slightly closer to my screen, scanning it for a brief moment before straightening again. Good, she said. Let me know if you need help. Her voice remained calm, friendly, but now Something about it felt different. After she walked away, I sat still for several seconds, listening to the hum of office noise around me. Phones ringing, chairs shifting, conversations blending into background noise. Everything looked normal. But inside me, something had changed. For the rest of the afternoon, I watched more carefully. Elena moved between desks frequently. She checked shared folders often. At one point, I noticed her standing near the printer, collecting documents I didn't remember submitting. Late in the day, when most employees began packing up, I stayed behind once again. The office grew quiet. The overhead lights buzzed faintly as the sun dipped below the windows. I reopened the version history logs, this time searching deeper. Scrolling, reading, comparing timestamps. That was when I noticed something else. The same name appeared again. Not once, not twice, but across multiple files. Every edit happened after I left for the day. Every modification followed the same pattern. Submission, delay, change. I stared at the screen until my eyes began to ache. Because mistakes could happen once. Confusion could happen twice. But patterns meant intention. And when I finally scrolled through the full activity log, one truth settled into place with terrifying clarity. The same user ID appeared again and again. Elena Brooks. That was the moment the doubt inside me hardened into something colder. Because the friendly face I trusted most in that office might be the one quietly destroying my future. The next morning, I walked into the office carrying a secret I wasn't ready to share. Knowing Elena's name had appeared over and over in those logs changed the way everything looked. Her smile, her voice, the gentle patience she showed when teaching me the system. None of it felt the same anymore. But I couldn't afford to react. Not yet. When I reached my desk, I placed my bag down carefully and powered on my computer, forcing my hands to move slowly. Naturally, I had spent years learning how to hide worry during hospital visits, insurance calls, long nights when fear needed to stay silent so others wouldn't panic. That same discipline kept my face calm now. Morning. Maggie. Elena's voice came from my left. I turned toward her, offering a polite smile that felt heavier than it should have. Morning. She placed a stack of printed pages on my desk. New assignment, she said cheerfully. Victor wants this reviewed today. Another assignment. So soon. I glanced down at the documents, feeling a slow tension build inside my chest. The dataset looked even larger than the previous one. More rows. More codes I didn't recognize. You'll do great, Elena added, her tone warm and reassuring. I nodded. But this time, I didn't feel reassured. I felt watched. I spent the morning working slowly, carefully. Every number entered twice. Every total checked by hand before being recorded digitally. I wrote notes beside each section, documenting every step in my own handwriting. Old habits. The kind that once saved my husband and me from missing payments or forgetting deadlines during the worst years of his illness. Around mid-afternoon, Victor called for a department review meeting. My stomach tightened the moment I heard my name. Again. The conference room felt colder than usual when I stepped inside. Conversations faded as people took their seats. Papers shuffled. Chairs scraped quietly across the floor. Victor stood at the head of the table. Elena, he said, nodding briefly. She handed him a printed report. My report. I recognized the formatting immediately. Victor flipped through the pages slowly, deliberately, before placing them flat against the table. There are still discrepancies, he said. The words hit harder this time. Not because I was surprised, but because I wasn't. This is becoming a pattern. Margaret, he continued. Pattern. The word echoed inside my head like a warning bell. I leaned forward slightly, scanning the numbers across the printed sheet. Wrong again. Rows shifted. Totals altered. The same impossible changes I had seen before. Around me, coworkers shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided looking at me. Others exchanged quick glances with one another. The kind people make when they believe the outcome is already decided. Victor's voice remained calm but cold. "We cannot afford repeated negligence," he said. Negligence. The word felt heavier than humiliation. It sounded permanent. Official. Like something that would stay in my record long after this job ended. I noticed Elena sitting across from me. Her gaze lowered to the table, avoiding eye contact. That detail unsettled me more than anything else. The meeting ended with a warning, formal this time. Clear. Documented. When I returned to my desk, my hands felt heavier than usual, like they belonged to someone else. That was when I heard a voice beside me. "Rough morning." I turned and saw a man standing quietly near my workstation. Older than most employees, mid-60s. Maybe. Silver hair. Gentle expression. His presence carried the calm steadiness of someone who had seen enough in life to recognize trouble when it appeared. "I'm Tom," he said. "IT support." I nodded politely. "Maggie," I replied. He glanced briefly toward the conference room before lowering his voice. "Sometimes computers don't make mistakes," he said softly. "People do." The words settled heavily between us. I hesitated, then asked, "What do you mean?" Tom leaned slightly closer, his tone still calm. "Have you checked the full audit trail on your files?" My pulse quickened. "Not just version history. Full audit trail." "No," I admitted quietly. He nodded, as if confirming something he already suspected. "Come by my station later," he said. "I'll show you how." Before I could respond, he stepped away as casually as he had arrived. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. I forced myself to complete the assigned tasks, double-checking every line, documenting everything carefully. But my attention kept drifting back to Tom's words. Audit trail. That evening, after most of the office had emptied, I walked toward the IT department. Tom sat at his desk, reviewing something on his screen. He looked up as I approached. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded. He motioned for me to sit beside him and began explaining the deeper system logs, records that tracked every movement, every modification, every access attempt tied to specific files. "Every action leaves a footprint," he said. As he guided me through the process, lines of data began filling the screen. Timestamps, user IDs, file names. My breath slowed, then tightened. We opened my earlier reports, one by one. Each entry told the same story. Submission, delay, modification. Tom leaned back slightly, letting me read the entries on my own. Several changes occurred late at night, long after I'd gone home, long after my computer had been shut down. I swallowed hard. "This doesn't look random," I whispered. Tom didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched my face carefully, as if measuring how much truth I could handle. After a moment, he spoke. "Patterns don't happen by accident." Later that night, after Tom left, I stayed behind to review more logs on my own. I began writing timestamps on paper, aligning them side by side. My handwriting grew tighter as the pattern revealed itself more clearly. Every altered file followed the same sequence: submission, delay, modification, exposure, over and over. My pulse thudded loudly in my ears as I scrolled through the final section of logs. There it was again. The same username appearing repeatedly. Not once, not twice, but over a dozen times. Elena Brooks. I stared at the screen, unable to look away. Because by that point, the truth was no longer a suspicion. It was evidence. One mistake could be coincidence. 2 mistakes could be confusion. But 12? 12 was a plan. And someone in that office had chosen me as the target. The next morning, I walked into the office with a calm I didn't recognize in myself. Not peace, not confidence, something colder than that. Something controlled. I greeted Elena the same way I always had, offering the polite smile she expected. My voice sounded steady when I said good morning. But inside, every movement felt calculated. If she noticed anything different, she didn't show it. Instead, she leaned casually against my desk. "Hey," she said brightly. Want to grab lunch today? My treat. The invitation caught me off guard. In the weeks I had been there, Elena had been helpful, patient, even kind, but never social. Never personal. Lunch felt deliberate. Still, refusing would raise questions. Sure, I replied after a short pause. Her smile widened slightly. Great. We'll go around noon. For the rest of the morning, I worked carefully, pretending everything was normal. But my mind replayed the logs I had seen the night before. Elena's name repeated across multiple entries like a quiet confession hidden in plain sight. At noon, we walked across the street to a small cafe tucked between two office buildings. The air smelled of roasted coffee and toasted bread. The kind of place where co-workers chatted casually and deadlines felt temporarily distant. Elena spoke easily, as if we were old friends. So, how are you settling in? She asked while stirring cream into her coffee. I'm learning, I said carefully. She nodded. It's not easy here. People think it is, but everyone's fighting for survival. That phrase lingered in the air. Fighting for survival. Her tone wasn't bitter, but it carried a quiet intensity that made me look at her differently. What do you mean? I asked. She shrugged slightly. There's a promotion coming up. Senior compliance analyst. Big role. Big responsibility. She smiled faintly. Everyone wants it. I watched her closely. Ambition had replaced warmth in her expression. And Victor reviews performance histories personally, she added, almost casually. Every detail matters. Something about that statement made my stomach tighten. Performance histories. Mistakes. Patterns. Suddenly, my repeated failures didn't feel accidental anymore. After lunch, we returned to the office together. I moved more slowly now, observing everything with sharper attention. That afternoon, I noticed Elena entering Victor's office more frequently than usual. Each time she stepped out, her expression shifted, calm but tense, like someone balancing on a narrow edge. Later, while walking past the hallway near Victor's office, I overheard something that made me stop. Cannot afford another audit problem, Victor said quietly. The word audit echoed in my mind like a distant warning bell. I slowed my steps just enough to listen without being obvious. We'll handle it, Elena replied. Her voice sounded lower than usual, more serious. Then footsteps approached, and I moved quickly down the hallway before anyone noticed. Audit problem. The phrase refused to leave my thoughts. Back at my desk, I watched Victor more carefully than before. At one point, as I passed his office with a stack of documents, I noticed him closing a file abruptly the moment he saw me. Too quickly. Too deliberately. Something larger was happening beneath the surface of daily routines. Later that afternoon, I overheard two co-workers discussing the promotion Elena mentioned earlier. Only 2 weeks until they decide. One said quietly, "That position controls compliance oversight." The other replied, "Big responsibility. Compliance oversight? Financial accuracy." My chest tightened. That was the same area where my reports kept failing. Suddenly, the pattern felt clearer. If my work appeared unreliable, Elena would look stronger by comparison. Sabotage wasn't just about ruining me. It was about elevating her. That evening, after most employees left, I stayed behind once again. The quiet office had become familiar territory, dim lights, distant hums, shadows stretching across empty desks. I began reviewing archived messages, moving slowly through old communication threads. At first, everything looked routine. Standard updates, deadline reminders, internal notes. Then I found something strange. A partially deleted email thread. Curiosity tightened my focus. I clicked carefully. The message loaded in fragments, sentences missing. Attachments incomplete, but enough remained to reveal something unsettling. Adjustment approved. Temporary correction. Review postponed. The words didn't sound like routine accounting language. They sounded like compromise. My eyes scanned the sender list. Victor Hale. Elena Brooks. My pulse quickened. That was when the truth began to settle into place. My repeated failures weren't random. They were useful. If errors appeared under my name, attention would shift toward me instead of the real problem. I wasn't just a mistake. I was a shield. A scapegoat. As I scrolled further, I noticed something else. A correction file labeled under my account. Adjusted under Intern account. The words made my chest tighten painfully. I hadn't made those adjustments, but my name had been attached to them. Later that evening, as I walked past Victor's office again, I noticed the door slightly open. Voices drifted through the gap. "She's already under pressure," Victor said. Elena answered quietly. "If she makes one more mistake, it solves our problem." I froze. Every muscle in my body went still. They were talking about me. "Are you sure she hasn't noticed anything yet?" Elena asked. Victor responded after a pause. "She won't. People like her never do." The words sliced deeper than any public humiliation. People like her. Older. Slower. Disposable. I backed away silently. My heartbeat pounding so loudly I feared they might hear it through the wall. When I returned to my desk, my hands trembled as I reached for the keyboard. There was only one place left to look. The restricted archive folder. The same one Elena had closed so quickly days earlier. I hesitated for a moment before clicking. Unexpectedly, it opened. File after file appeared on the screen. Old reports. Archived audits. Transaction histories. My breathing slowed as I scrolled deeper. Then I saw it. Audit review. Pending correction. I opened the file carefully. Rows of transactions filled the screen. Numbers shifted across multiple columns. Some entries dated months before I was even hired. That was when the final realization hit. These discrepancies existed long before I walked through those doors. Long before my name appeared on any reports. I stared at the screen. Heart pounding steadily now, not from panic, but from certainty. Because this wasn't just about office politics anymore. This wasn't just about a promotion. If those numbers were wrong before I ever arrived, then I hadn't been sabotaged by accident. I had been chosen. I sat there long after the office lights dimmed, staring at the screen until the numbers blurred together. Chosen. That word echoed inside my head like a slow drumbeat. Not unlucky. Not careless. Chosen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard while I studied one particular line in the audit file. Pending correction, intern verification. My breath caught in my throat. Intern verification. That meant someone intended for my name to be attached to those numbers eventually. Someone expected me to confirm transactions I had never seen before. Someone was preparing to place responsibility directly on my shoulders. I leaned back slowly, pressing my palms flat against the desk. This wasn't just about losing a job anymore. If those numbers were traced back to me, it wouldn't look like incompetence. It would look like fraud. And fraud followed you for the rest of your life. The next morning, I found Tom before most employees arrived. He was already at his station, sipping coffee and scrolling through system logs when I approached. "Tom?" I said quietly. He looked up immediately, reading my expression before I spoke another word. "You found something," he said. I nodded. "Can we talk somewhere private?" A few minutes later, we sat in the small break room at the far end of the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above us, casting pale shadows across the table. I slid my notebook toward him, turning it so he could see the entries I had copied by hand. These were in the restricted archive. I said, "There's a transaction flagged for intern verification, and I never touched it." Tom studied the page carefully. His jaw tightened slightly. "That's not routine," he murmured. "What does it mean?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. "It means someone expected to attach your credentials to something questionable." The words made my stomach drop. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Tom leaned forward. "There's something else you need to see," he said, back at his workstation. He opened a series of archived contract files. Rows of data appeared on the screen: shipment schedules, vendor agreements, payment approvals. He clicked into one file and turned the monitor slightly so I could read. This contract, he said quietly, is one of the company's largest freight agreements. I scanned the page carefully. Numbers filled every column: fuel costs, transport fees, labor expenses. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. But then I noticed something strange. Two totals didn't match. Not slightly. Significantly. Wait, I whispered. I grabbed a notepad and began recalculating the figures manually. Years of accounting experience guided my pencil as I worked through the numbers step by step. When I reached the final total, I froze. It's off, I said. Tom nodded grimly. Exactly. The discrepancy wasn't small. It wasn't the kind of rounding error someone might overlook. It was deliberate. My eyes drifted to the scanned copy of the original document. There, in faint handwriting along the margin, were 4 words. Temporary adjustment approved. Approved. Someone authorized those changes. Someone powerful enough to make irregular numbers appear legitimate. Later that afternoon, Victor called me into his office. My pulse quickened as I walked down the hallway. The walls felt closer than usual. The air heavier. Victor sat behind his desk, hands folded neatly in front of him. "Margaret," he said calmly, "have a seat." I lowered myself into the chair across from him, keeping my posture steady. "I've noticed you staying late recently," he continued. His voice was smooth, almost conversational. "Yes," I replied. "I've been double-checking my work." He studied me carefully. "Curiosity can be dangerous in the wrong environment," he said. The words landed heavily. Not an accusation, not a threat, but something in between. A warning. "I understand," I said quietly. Victor leaned back slightly. "Good," he replied. "Because we rely on accuracy here." He slid another stack of data across the desk. "I want this completed by tomorrow." The data set looked larger than any I had handled so far. More pressure. More risk. As I left his office, a slow realization formed inside me. Elena may have been making the changes, but Victor was guiding the direction. Back at my desk, I watched more carefully. Elena carried files into Victor's office twice within the hour. Each time, he reviewed them personally before signing off. That was when I noticed something else. A third name appearing on certain authorization lines. Someone I didn't recognize. Someone above them both. That evening, after most employees had gone home, I sat alone reviewing the contract files again. My thoughts drifted backward, to a memory I hadn't revisited in years. Daniel, my husband. I remembered the night he realized his retirement savings had vanished into a fraudulent investment scheme. The hollow look in his eyes. The silence that filled our living room after the truth came out. We spent years rebuilding what had been taken. Years learning how fragile financial security really was. That memory burned quietly inside me now. Not this time. I told myself, not again. I returned my focus to the screen. One decision formed slowly but firmly in my mind. If this situation grew worse, evidence stored inside the company system wouldn't be safe. I needed copies. External copies. My hands trembled slightly as I inserted a secure storage device into the computer. File by file, I began saving records. Contracts. Logs. Authorization histories. Each transfer felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But staying silent would be worse. As the files transferred, a small notification flashed briefly across the screen. Access activity logged. My breath caught. Someone, somewhere, would see that message. When the final file finished copying, I opened the last document in the folder. Scrolling slowly, I studied the signature approvals again. Victor's name appeared. Elena's name appeared. But above them, another signature stood out. Senior Executive Authorization. Someone higher than both of them had approved those numbers. My chest tightened as realization settled in. This wasn't just sabotage. This wasn't just office rivalry. This reached beyond my department, beyond my manager, beyond everything I thought I understood. And for the first time since this began, A deeper fear took hold. Because exposing the truth might not just cost someone else their job. It might cost me mine. I woke before sunrise with my heart already racing. Sleep had come in short. Restless bursts. Each one filled with fragments of numbers and signatures floating behind my eyelids. Victor's name. Elena's name. And that third signature, higher, colder, more dangerous than anything I had expected to find. I lay there in the quiet darkness of my bedroom, staring at the ceiling while the early morning light slowly crept through the curtains. This was no longer about embarrassment. No longer about office drama. This was deception at a level I had never imagined walking into when I accepted that intern position. I sat up slowly and reached for the small storage device hidden inside my purse. I held it in my palm for a moment, feeling its weight, small, harmless looking, yet carrying information that could destroy careers. Maybe even mine. After dressing carefully, I left the house earlier than usual. The streets were still quiet, the sky pale and colorless. When I pulled into the company parking lot, something immediately caught my attention. A black company vehicle sat near the main entrance. Unfamiliar. Engine off. Windows dark. I sat in my car longer than usual, watching it. Nothing moved, but the sight of it planted a strange unease deep in my chest. Inside the building, everything felt different. Not visibly different, no alarms. No shouting, but something subtle had shifted. Conversations quieted slightly when I walked past. A few employees glanced at me longer than usual before turning back to their screens. Even Elena's smile felt tighter. More controlled, more watchful. When I reached my desk and logged into my computer, the screen froze. Then a message appeared. Access temporarily denied. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I tried again. Same message. A chill spread through my body. That wasn't normal. I stood up slowly and walked toward Tom's workstation, keeping my movement steady. Casual. He looked up the moment I approached. "You're locked out," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "What does that mean?" I asked under my breath. Tom leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "It means your account has been flagged for administrative review." My pulse pounded in my ears. "Flagged? Why?" He shook his head slightly. "I don't know yet. But if management escalates it," he hesitated, "you could be terminated today." The word terminated hit harder than I expected. Not because I feared losing the job, but because losing the job now could make everything disappear before the truth surfaced. Time was running out. I walked into the restroom and locked myself inside one of the stalls. For the first time in days, my composure cracked. My hands trembled. My breathing came faster than I could control. I pressed my palms against my knees, forcing myself to stay still. "Walk away," a voice whispered inside my head. "Walk away before this gets worse." But another voice rose louder. "Stronger. If you walk away now, they win." I closed my eyes. And suddenly, I was somewhere else, years earlier, standing in the dim hospital hallway outside Daniel's room, watching bills stack up, listening to doctors explain treatments we could barely afford. I remembered the helplessness, the exhaustion, the quiet shame of realizing someone had stolen our savings through deception we didn't understand at the time. That pain had changed me. It taught me to read numbers carefully, to question what didn't make sense, to refuse silence when something felt wrong. Not this time. I stood up slowly and walked back to my desk. My login access still hadn't been restored, but the files I had copied the night before were safe, stored outside the system. Carefully, I opened my email and began sending encrypted copies of key documents to a secure personal account I trusted. Each file attached felt like placing bricks into a foundation that couldn't be erased. One message. 2. 3. Each sent with deliberate precision. If they locked me out completely, the truth would still exist somewhere beyond their control. Throughout the afternoon, the office atmosphere grew heavier. Elena approached my desk twice, asking small questions that felt less like concern and more like investigation. "You doing okay?" she asked softly. Just waiting on system access, I replied calmly. Her smile lingered a moment too long before she walked away. Later, Victor called an unexpected department meeting. We gathered in the conference room once again, tension hanging thick in the air. Victor stood at the head of the table. Expression unreadable? We will be conducting an internal procedural review, he announced. The words landed like stones. Internal review. My pulse quickened. Victor's eyes swept across the room slowly. All employees are expected to cooperate fully, he continued. The message felt directed at everyone, but somehow it felt especially directed at me. After the meeting ended, I returned to my desk with a growing sense that the walls were closing in. Then, sometime mid-afternoon, a notification appeared in my inbox. Subject line: mandatory attendance required. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened the message. An emergency executive-level meeting had been scheduled for later that day. Attendance list included Victor Hale, Elena Brooks, several senior executives, and my name. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't routine. This was confrontation. Tom appeared beside my desk moments later, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is bigger than you think," he said. I nodded slowly. Because deep down, I already knew. Late in the afternoon, I stood alone outside the executive conference room. The hallway felt unnaturally quiet, heavy. The door in front of me remained closed, voices murmuring faintly behind it. I stared at the polished handle, my reflection faintly visible in the metal. This moment felt irreversible. Everything I had discovered, every file, every suspicion, had led to this single point. My hand lifted slowly, resting against the handle. That door wasn't just the entrance to another meeting. It was the threshold between silence and truth. And once I stepped inside, there would be no turning back. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room felt colder than the hallway, heavier somehow, as if the air itself carried the weight of what was about to happen. A long conference table stretched across the center, surrounded by people I had never seen before. Senior executives, legal representatives, faces that carried authority without needing to speak. Victor sat near the head of the table, posture straight, expression calm but tight around the edges. Elena sat beside him, hands folded neatly in front of her, eyes lowered. I felt every gaze shift toward me as I entered. There was no turning back now. "Please, have a seat," one of the executives said. His voice was firm but measured. I walked to the empty chair waiting for me, each step steady despite the pounding of my heart. As I sat down, I noticed a thick folder placed directly in front of Victor. My name was printed clearly across the front. Margaret Doyle. My chest tightened. The meeting began without ceremony. Victor spoke first. "We've called this session to address repeated performance failures tied to intern-level reporting," he said calmly. Performance failures. The words sounded rehearsed. Prepared. He opened the folder and began sliding documents across the table, distributing them to the executives. "These reports," he continued, "contain multiple discrepancies submitted under Margaret Doyle's credentials." I glanced down at the copies placed in front of me. My reports. Altered again. Numbers shifted. Totals changed. The same impossible errors staring back at me like evidence waiting to condemn. Elena spoke next. Her voice sounded softer, sympathetic even. "Margaret has struggled to adapt to the pace of our systems," she said. "We've provided support, but the errors have continued." Struggled. The word cut deeper than negligence. Around the table, executives flipped through the pages quietly. My pulse pounded in my ears. This was their moment. Their carefully built case. Victor leaned forward slightly. "At this point," he said, "we believe her continued access presents a risk." Risk. Not employee. Not intern. Risk. I felt the weight of their accusation pressing down from every side. But I didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, I listened. Years of surviving uncertainty had taught me something important. Sometimes the strongest move was patience. Let them speak first. Let them reveal everything. Elena began outlining a timeline of my supposed failures. Dates, file names, error counts. Each entry painted me as careless, unreliable, disposable. Victor nodded along as she spoke, reinforcing each statement with quiet authority. Finally, one of the senior executives turned toward me. "Ms. Doyle," he said calmly. "Do you have anything to say?" The room fell silent, every eye fixed on me. This was the moment. I reached into my folder slowly and removed the stack of documents I had prepared the night before. "Yes," I said quietly. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "I do." I placed my papers on the table, sliding them toward the center. "These are independent logs I kept during my assignments." I continued. "They record submission times and activity history connected to my reports." One executive leaned forward, scanning the pages. Victor shifted slightly in his seat. I pointed to the first timeline. Every report I submitted was completed correctly. I explained. But each one was modified after submission, after I had logged out. A murmur moved across the table. Elena's posture stiffened. Victor frowned. "That interpretation is incorrect," he said sharply. But I didn't stop. I turned to the next set of documents. "These are full audit logs." I continued. "They show modification activity tied to specific user credentials." I slid the page forward. The name appeared clearly. Elena Brooks. Silence fell across the room. Heavy. Unavoidable. One executive turned toward Elena. "Can you explain why these files were modified after submission?" he asked. Elena's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Her confidence, the calm warmth she carried for weeks, had begun to crack. Victor leaned forward quickly. "There are legitimate reasons for corrections," he said. "That doesn't indicate misconduct." I nodded slowly. "That's true," I replied calmly. "But corrections should be documented transparently." I reached for the final stack of papers. "These," I said, "are contract reconciliation records." The air in the room seemed to shift. Executives leaned closer. Victor's jaw tightened. "These records show discrepancies between contract totals and approved financial entries." I continued. "And those discrepancies existed before my employment began." A long silence followed. Then I pointed to the signature block at the bottom of one document. "Authorization signatures appear here," I said. Victor's name, Elena's name, and above them, a third signature. Senior executive approval. One of the executives at the far end of the table straightened slowly. "That file," he said quietly, "was already under internal review." My breath caught. He continued speaking, voice steady. "We suspected irregularities for months," he said, "but lacked verifiable evidence." His eyes shifted toward me. "Until now." Victor's expression hardened. Elena looked pale. The power in the room had shifted completely. Victor tried to speak again. "This is being misinterpreted." But the executive raised a hand. "That will be enough." His voice carried quiet authority that silenced the room instantly. He pressed a button near the table. Moments later, 2 security officers entered the room. Victor's face tightened. Elena stared forward, motionless. "You are both required to leave the building immediately pending investigation," the executive said. Victor stood slowly, maintaining composure, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. Elena rose beside him, her movements stiff, her confidence shattered. As they walked toward the door, I watched silently. The same people who once made me feel small, powerless, replaceable, were now being escorted out under watchful eyes. The door closed behind them, and the silence that followed felt different from before. Not heavy, not threatening, just quiet. For the first time since the day I walked into that office, no one was looking at me like I was the problem. They were looking at me like I was the proof. The silence that followed their departure felt louder than anything that had come before. Victor and Elena were gone. The door had closed behind them with a soft click, but the sound echoed in my chest like thunder. For a long moment, no one spoke. Papers remained spread across the table, untouched. The air felt different now, lighter, but still heavy with everything that had just happened. I sat perfectly still, unsure whether to move or wait. One of the senior executives reached forward and slowly closed the thick folder that still carried my name on the cover. The sound of it snapping shut felt final. Like the closing of a chapter I hadn't even realized I was strong enough to survive. "Ms. Doyle," he said calmly. His voice was nothing like Victor's had been. There was no accusation in it. No judgment. Only attention. "Yes," I answered quietly. "We're going to ask you a few questions," he continued. "We need to understand how you discovered these discrepancies." I nodded slowly. My hands rested flat against the table as I began explaining everything. The first incorrect report, the altered timestamps, the pattern that refused to disappear, my nightly reviews, the handwritten notes, the audit trails. As I spoke, I noticed something strange. No one interrupted me. No one dismissed my words. They listened. Carefully. One executive leaned forward as he reviewed my documentation. "You recorded submission times independently?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "Every time." Another executive flipped through my notes slowly. "Most people wouldn't have noticed this pattern," he said quietly. His words lingered in the air. Wouldn't have noticed. For years, I had worried that stepping away from the workforce had made me outdated, slower, less capable. But now, the very habits I once thought were old-fashioned, writing things down, double-checking numbers, trusting instinct, had become my greatest strength. After several minutes, one of the executives stood and addressed the room. "We will be initiating a formal internal investigation," he announced. The words settled into place like stones forming a foundation. "Effective immediately," he continued. "All accounts belonging to Mr. Hale and Ms. Brooks are suspended pending review." A quiet murmur passed through the room. Legal representatives began gathering documents, speaking softly among themselves. I felt something inside my chest loosen for the first time in days. Relief. Not victory. Not celebration. Just relief. The kind that comes when you realize the truth has finally stepped into the light. After signing a formal statement documenting what I had discovered, most of the room gradually emptied. Chairs slid back. Papers were collected. Voices faded into distant conversation. Eventually, only two executives remained. "Ms. Doyle," one of them said, motioning for me to stay seated. A familiar tension returned to my shoulders. This was the part I hadn't prepared for. Was this where they dismissed me, thanked me, then escorted me out? The senior executive folded his hands calmly. "I want to thank you," he said. The words startled me. "For what?" I asked quietly. "For protecting this company from a very serious problem." My throat tightened unexpectedly. He continued speaking. "We suspected irregularities for months," he said. "But suspicion alone isn't enough. We needed proof. Your documentation provided that proof." I swallowed slowly. All those late nights. All those moments of doubt. Every trembling decision to keep going instead of walking away. They had mattered. "Have you ever considered working in compliance?" he asked. The question caught me completely off guard. "Compliance." I repeated. "Yes," he said. "You demonstrated attention to detail, patience, and professional judgment under pressure. Those are rare qualities." My chest tightened as the meaning settled in. "You entered this company as an intern," he continued. "But we believe your skills go far beyond that." He slid a document across the table toward me. "We would like to offer you a permanent position as a junior compliance analyst." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The words didn't feel real. Permanent position. Not intern. Not temporary. Permanent? I don't know what to say, I admitted quietly. He smiled slightly. "Say yes when you're ready." A slow warmth spread through my chest, something I hadn't felt in years. Respect. Not sympathy. Not tolerance. Respect. When I finally stepped out of the conference room, The office looked different somehow. Not physically. Emotionally. Coworkers glanced toward me as I walked past. Their expressions cautious. Curious. Some nodded politely. Others looked away quickly, unsure how to react. But no one looked at me with pity anymore. That alone felt like victory. Tom approached from across the room, his expression calm but knowing. "Well?" he asked quietly. I smiled, a real smile this time. "Better than I expected," I replied. He nodded once, satisfied. As I passed Elena's desk, I noticed it sitting empty. Her chair pushed in. Computer screen dark. Personal items already gone. The space looked strangely hollow, a reminder of how quickly things could change. That evening, I drove home slowly, letting the silence settle around me. The sun dipped low across the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, steady for the first time in days. I thought about Daniel, about the years spent fighting through loss, uncertainty, exhaustion, about the promise I made to myself never to ignore what didn't make sense. For years, I believed stepping away from work had cost me something valuable. But now I understood the truth. Those years didn't weaken me. They strengthened me. Patience. Attention. Resilience. Every challenge I faced had prepared me for this moment, even when I didn't realize it. Sometimes, the very things people see as your weakness become your greatest advantage. As I pulled into my driveway, the quiet of the evening wrapped around me like a gentle promise. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen, respected, whole. There will always be people who underestimate you, people who assume your time has passed, people who believe your voice doesn't matter anymore. But sometimes, all it takes is one moment of courage, one decision to trust yourself, to change everything. And if you've ever been in a place where someone made you feel small, overlooked, or unwanted, I want you to know something. You are not alone. There are more people out there carrying quiet strength than you realize. So if this story felt familiar, if you've ever faced a moment where your dignity was on the line, share your story. Tell me about it in the comments. Because your voice matters. And if stories like this remind you that strength doesn't fade with time, that experience, patience, and courage still means something, then stay with us. There are many more stories ahead. Stories about justice. Stories about survival. Stories about ordinary people who refused to stay silent. And if this story spoke to your heart, don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss what comes next.